from the role of the Fed. And during the ARC financial crisis, U.S. Treasury and the Fed were able to work very closely together and very quickly to develop effective tools to reassure markets that funding would continue to be available. The ECB's legal constraints have meant that there could not be such close relationship between the ECB and European treasuries, and for this reason, the mechanisms that are being created now to reassure markets that funding will be available need to be more complicated and have taken more time to design.
In discussing those differences, one of the reasons that Europe seems to be having difficulty with this is because, unlike the United States, where we have a union of 50 sovereign states governed by a federal government, the individual nations of the EU seem to be having trouble, and I think very understandably so, with the concept of their taxpayers bailing out the investors for problems that were caused by other nations' lack of fiscal discipline. In the United States, that was clearly a much lower hurdle to get over for the federal government to do, rather than trying to corral 50 different state legislatures to agree to do that. But doesn't the central principle of what they're trying to do in the EU equate with what was done in the TARP? In short, whether it is by individual nations of the EU or done in the United States by the federal government, the way they're trying to solve this crisis of confidence is to essentially tell investors, to the greatest of their ability, that you will not lose money under any circumstance, and that the taxpayers will cover it if you run into this. Is that not the case?
That is certainly the case, and that's particularly relevant for the creation of this firewall that we have discussed. But I think the problems in Europe go well beyond the construction of the firewall. There also needs to be these fundamental economic reforms in a number of countries in Europe, and Greece being the most prominent example. A commitment to massive fiscal consolidation and to deep-rooted reforms that restore dynamism to the Greek economy. Ultimately, the European crisis cannot be resolved until countries around Europe are able to convince markets they are going to be able to achieve the fiscal adjustments and the economic reforms that restore sustainability.
And just, if I may, Mr. Chairman, just a quick point. That one of the problems that Greece experienced, much like it once did during the time of the Athenian city-state, was when people realized that they could avail themselves of the public treasury for their own benefit. And the absence of fiscal discipline that you see out of a country like Greece, where they have an exploding public sector and an anemic private sector, are not necessarily constrained to Europe. Thank you.
I like starting with Athenian democracy, working through the Roman Republic, and we could go on. That'd be a great way to start this. I like that. Mr. Lynch, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member. Again, this is a very important hearing. Mr. Secretary, one of the next panel witnesses, Desmond Lockman from the American Enterprise Institute, has raised some interesting questions. And he points out that now the IMF is acknowledging that Greece's economic and budget performance has been very much worse than originally anticipated. He points out that there's been a 12% contraction in Greece's real GDP over the last 24 months. Their unemployment has increased to over 15%, and that the situation there makes it a substantial write-down of Greek sovereign debt in the amount of about $500 billion, highly probable within the next few months. So it's, in many analysts' minds, it's not a question of whether Greece will default, but when. That would be the largest such default in history. the IMF is proposing that the European banks accept a 50 to 60 cents on the dollar write-down on their Greek sovereign debt holdings, and that would have a material impact on European banks' capital reserve positions. So what I'm worrying about is whether these European banks, or have these European banks, or will these European banks be required to mark to market their Greek debt before the recapitalization plan goes forward, because that obviously represents a delta or a difference between what they're saying their capitalization will be versus what we determine it to be after stress tests and after properly marking down this Greek debt. And do we have any sense of the real strength, the real health of these European banks?
The European banks have already been significantly marking down.
But the IMF now is saying, given today's situation,
Right.
they're looking for a 50 to 60 cents on the dollar write-down of Greek debt.
Right.
And so that...
The markets have already been pricing in a very substantial discount on
But the banks aren't marking to market their assets. That's the problem. The markets are discounting them, but that the banks are not showing that markdown on their balance sheets. So if you're going to stuff those banks full of money to save them, there would be a lot more money involved than what the banks are saying. That's the problem I have.
Right. So banks have, in fact, been making progress in marking down their exposure to Greece on their balance sheets. I mean, they haven't gone all the way.
Not
yet.
nearly, though. 15%, not 50%.
Over time, they are moving. In the recapitalization exercise that is now underway, this exercise will take into account sovereign risk in assessing banks' need for capital. And that assessment of sovereign risk will be based on market valuations rather than book value valuations of bank capital. So this exercise should be much more effective in boosting bank capital than previous exercises that the Europeans have undertaken over the past.
Don't you think your analysis is unrealistically rosy from what we're seeing? I mean, just look at the data. Look at what's happening. Look at the contraction in the economies. Look at the slowdown even in some of the core countries like Germany and France. Right. I'm not trying to take you to task for anything. I think you're doing a great job. I just think that we're not being realistic with what's coming down the road, and that is inhibiting our ability to prepare for that. Right. That's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to be the bearer of bad news. I just know what the numbers tell me. And you try to prepare for that instead of constructing this, from what we've seen so far in the response from the European Union, and God bless them, it's difficult because they are not unitary like we are, as Mr. McCarter pointed out before. They don't have a single Fed and a single Treasury totally committed to one program. It's been rather fragmented. But all I'm saying is that we can't build our expectations or our course of action based on very rosy scenarios that you're playing out here. Someone's got to sound the alarm, and I think your folks at Treasury are probably the people to do that. And if you don't, then you're letting us walk this we're walking right into this, and we're not taking, I think, reasonable precautions under the circumstances.
We are certainly expressing our grave concerns based on our perceptions of the downside risks. We don't just look at baseline scenarios that may be optimistic, but rather we try to think, well, what could go wrong, and how do we take steps to make sure that the downside risks are not realized, both by encouraging the Europeans to take more forceful action to deal with their problems, and by making sure that we have adequate defenses here in the U.S., and in particular the U.S. financial system is adequately protected from potential risk events. That's the crucial part of what the FSOC has been doing.
Have we done an assessment on what our
Time's
exposure is?
expired.
I'm sorry. Thank you
Trying to
for
be generous.
Thank you for your tolerance.
You and I
Mr.
had
President.
the same
appreciate
concern. I wish Germany would use more of a Panzer approach to getting this done, but they're very cautious on that, that kind of concept. But them moving rapidly wouldn't hurt the market. Mr. Huizinga, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to come. And apologies, I had a bill up in front of the another committee and had to testify on that. So I'm trying to catch up based on some notes and some things that were handed to me. And I just thought if you could address a little bit about U.S. exposure, whether there's direct exposure or exposure through other organizations that we're involved in, IMF, for example, and what that may mean to the taxpayer.
Right. Well, U.S. Direct exposure to the weakest countries in the periphery, to Greece, Portugal, and Ireland, is really quite minimal. And financial institutions have been aware of the risk. They've been lowering their exposure. And the residual risk is very small. The concern is that there is a deep interconnectedness more broadly between the American financial system and the European financial system. The exposure to financial institutions in the European core are very large indeed. And these are institutions that themselves are exposed to risk in the European periphery. So any increase in volatility and market uncertainty about the financial institutions in the European core very quickly translate into increased uncertainty in U.S. financial markets, and we have seen that playing out over the past couple of months. And this is an area where U.S. financial supervisors have been working very closely together with U.S. financial institutions to try to identify these risks and contain the risks. And an important topic for an important focus for the FSOC as they consider
it seems to me that
system.
exposure and risk might be two different things to a way. I understand the mitigation of the risk, but do we have exposure? And through the IMF or through some other organizations, if and when, because I think I agree with my colleagues here as well. I'm very concerned about what may be happening, and how does that translate? And then, adding into that some of the requirements that may be coming with under Basel III and those types of things. How does that all play into their ability to recover?
So the U.S. government has minimal direct exposure. We do not lend significant sums to countries like Greece. We are supportive of the IMF playing a significant role in helping Europe to deal with this crisis. The IMF has provided around a third of the financing for countries like Greece, Ireland, and Portugal. And the United States makes a financial contribution to the IMF. However, this financial contribution does not put the U.S. taxpayer at material risk. The IMF has preferred creditor status, which means it gets repaid first. In the past, the record of repayment to the IMF has been excellent. The U.S. taxpayer has never lost a cent through its exposure to the IMF. So the IMF really plays an ideal vehicle for us to make sure that the European programs are well designed based on the IMF's role, drawing on its long experience and expertise in dealing with financial crises, while at the same time providing a certain amount of financing. But
we've got just over a minute, and I'm wondering if you could touch on Basel and what that may mean as they're trying to recover.
Basel III is very important to improve the capital adequacy standards in banks in the U.S. and in Europe, in reducing excessive reliance on market funding and improving liquidity. As banks have moved towards strengthening their positions in these respects, their exposure to potential risk is correspondingly reduced. So we think that the Basel III is already playing an important factor. I mean, the rules themselves do not yet come fully into effect, but financial institutions are anticipating